In this video, I give a quick overview of the installation of an ARB Air Locker in my 2008 Hummer H3 Alpha. Okay, so I'm finally getting around to making a video of the installation of my air locker on my 2008 Hummer H3 Alpha. Rather than just go from the top of my head and leave out probably half the important stuff, I actually wrote myself some notes to make sure I remember them. First of all, this is a mostly stock 2008 Hummer H3 Alpha. So it has no suspension mods. For recovery, there's a lot of good stuff from the factory. I added front and rear receivers. Well, I already had a rear receiver with the tow package, and I ran the wiring for a receiver winch so I can winch in either direction. Added the front brush bar really for two reasons. One, protection against an animal hit, and two, a place to secure limb risers on those very rare occasions when you really need them. I keep those in my center console, so between the mount for the light bar and the brush bar I can set up coated cable limb risers. I added the hood louvers when the fake vent that comes in these trucks finally blew off. They end up failing. There was a recall where they would glue it to your hood. I waited until mine finally did completely tear off, and then I just put this stamped aluminum set of louvers on there with holes cut in the hood for ventilation. Lighting, I have LED bulbs in the factory fog lights and the LED light bar that I added many years ago. In terms of comms, I have a built-in, I added it, a built-in Kenwood ham radio. You can kind of see off to the side it's folded down how I did the NMO antenna base. I also have replaced the factory radio with a repaired Kenwood unit that I took out of my wife's truck when it failed, got it repaired, and then put it in this one. There's removable small T-slot aluminum frame in the back, so I don't have like a drawer system or anything like that. I put that there to support the CO2 canister I use for airing up, some ammo cans I use for tool storage, and when we are driving somewhere overlanding, I keep the fridge in the truck. So I have a big IceCo fridge that goes on those T-slot aluminum mounts. It's just the factory roof rack up there that holds the traction boards just with a couple of bungees. I didn't make any permanent changes because I use a trailer for overlanding, so I didn't have to make a lot of changes like rear seat delete to the truck. I use the factory rack for a lot of different things. You can see up front there I've added a Yakima bar. On the other side it has the slide out for loading a canoe. So again, I use the factory rack for a lot of stuff, so I didn't really have any interest in changing it. And in the back again you can kind of see I made a custom mount using the factory roof rack rails to support the ham antenna. Now, if you're curious about that selected group of mods that I've made in the approximately 12 years that I've owned this truck, it probably makes more sense if you understand I don't do a lot of hardcore off-roading. I've done some, I've done rock climbing, I've been to some of the named trails, but I don't go out of my way to find obstacles to challenge the truck. And again, I use an M416 trailer for my camping equipment, my rooftop tent. The rack and all that stuff is on there, so I really didn't need to modify the truck with slide-out drawers or a lot of stuff attached to the rear spare carrier or anything like that, because the trailer takes care of that for me. Okay, so again, the purpose of this video is to talk about the installation of an ARB air locker. So why did I decide to put an air locker in my front axle? First of all, a 2008 H3 Alpha has a number of nice features. It has an LSV8, a 4-to-1 transfer case, 410 gears, and an E-locker in the rear axle. 2009 and 2010 models, just before they completely stopped making Hummers, had a factory front E-locker. So I guess I always kind of had locker envy that the later models were locked in front, mine wasn't. I also like to overland in very remote areas. So I'm often the only vehicle. If I'm not by myself, I'm typically the only vehicle. So getting stuck could be very expensive. You know, even if you have a Garmin spot, the cost of bringing someone out to extract you from a really remote place is pretty daunting. I'd rather avoid that. Now ARB has a number of very good videos making the case for lockers, air lockers. Nate Pickle from Dirt Lifestyle has a really good one. There's plenty out there. But in ARBs, they make a simple case, two ways you typically get stuck. One is the vehicle is perched and the tires can't contact anything. That can happen if you high center. It can happen if you kind of have momentum into deep snow or mud and you just end up with your wheels kind of up in the mush. And the second way is you don't have enough traction. Basically, you can't get enough torque to enough wheels that are in contact with the ground. Lockers address that second problem, the problem of having not enough traction, not being able to use the wheels that are in contact with the ground to get you out of wherever you are. There's also a lot of good videos explaining all-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, part-time four-wheel drive, full-time four-wheel drive. This truck has a full-time four-wheel drive system. So that means stock from the factory the way it came. When this truck is in 4 high, I have an open diff basically in the transfer case. So worst case, I'm driving in 4 high and I have a traction problem. All the torque could be sent to one spinning wheel and I basically have a one-wheel drive truck. When I lock the transfer case in 4 high from the factory, I now have worst case, one spinning wheel in front, one spinning wheel in back. Two-wheel drive, true two-wheel drive. 4 low lock locks the transfer case and then enables the factory rear locker. So at that point I lock my rear axle. Worst case, I have 3 wheels that can turn. Now the factory e-locker in the rear is only available when I'm in 4 low lock and I'm below about 12 miles per hour. So it's pretty limited in how it can be used, although I will say it hasn't really been an issue for me in the past. Usually when I needed it, I was in 4 low and I wasn't going fast. Now an ARB front air locker changes all of that. I can engage it at any reasonable speed, just the front axle cannot be under load, so I can't be accelerating, I can't be changing the motion of the truck significantly. So like if you're trying to climb something, yeah, you have to stop, get the load off the axle, then you can safely engage the air locker. But other than that, it's fine. So once I lock the transfer case, worst case I have 3-wheel drive, and if I'm using, assuming I engage the air locker, and with the rear locker under 12 miles an hour, 4 low lock, worst case I have all 4 wheels turning in any circumstance. That's pretty cool, and it's a nice feature to have. Okay, so where do I expect to get benefit from installing a front air locker in my truck? Snow, a lot of snow where I live here in the Midwest. Mud, steep climbs. So you've probably seen this many times where you really want all 4 wheels trying to pull you up the hill. Even in relatively dry conditions, if you get that angle of climb high enough, say like 23 degrees, upwards of there, you can really start to feel your wheel slip. One of the worst rollover videos I ever saw is done like that, where a guy's up a steep climb, doesn't realize his front wheels start to hop. By the time he catches it, it's too late. The truck starts to go sideways on the hill and rolls all the way down the hill. So good traction in steep climbs, very helpful. And then probably the most common time when I've wanted lockers and have needed my rear locker, although certainly climbing rocks up has been one of them, is straddling deep ruts and washouts. That's where you can end up in this teeter-totter seesaw configuration where you just can't get more than 2 wheels to contact the ground with any kind of traction. And that's where the rear locker has gotten me free before, but being able to lock both ends makes it that much easier. Okay, finally, I should probably talk a little bit. I'll go through the installation and then I'll kind of come back to some other topics, but I should explain too, I paid someone else to do this install. Most of the work on this truck I do myself, not all of it. An air locker essentially involves the equivalent of disassembling your differential, like your rear gearing. It takes special tools, a lot of skill and experience, and a lot of patience to do that. So it's not something for a DIY guy just to go attempt. There is a lot to it. So I paid an off-road shop that installs ARB air lockers all the time. And again, not just someone who rebuilds axles, but ARB air lockers typically fail because they lose air pressure. And a lot of that's due to the install. So I paid someone who's recommended by ARB. They're a very reputable off-road shop, Complete Off-Road in Dubuque, Iowa. They know what they're doing. I expect this to last a good long time without any loss of seal. So then now I'm going to just kind of walk through the truck, kind of show the aspects of the installation, and I'll hit a few other topics of what I've done with it so far. I'll explain in more detail later in the video, but I highly recommend using an experienced installer for an air locker. I used Complete Off-Road in Dubuque, Iowa. Okay, one of the first things you have to decide if you're going to do an air locker is what type of air compressor and mounting it where. Now in my case, I didn't want any of the large twin cylinder compressors because I use CO2 to air back up. So all I really needed was this kind of small, modest compressor that has an adequate air tank, basically to actuate the lockers, or in my case, just one because I have an E-locker. I could also put a tap on there and use it to inflate tires. It would just take forever because that's got a typical like flow rate in cubic feet per minute of like one of these little cheap 12-volt emergency compressors. And I do keep one of those too in case I run out of CO2, which did happen to me the other day in Montana. But again, I chose to mount it there. Now that metal plate typically would go underneath the compressor, not the way I did it. It just kind of worked out better this way, that it sits very nicely there, and that gives that sheet metal a little additional strength. And again, you just run the wiring harness around back to the firewall to the rocker switches. And right here you can see, because this is an independent front suspension application, it's actually kind of handy that the differential doesn't move around a lot. It's not like a solid axle where the whole axle moves with your wheels, or the differential does. In this case, the differential and its housing are mounted with 3 bushings, the equivalent of like engine mounts, and it moves very little. The axles articulate up and down. So again, you can kind of see there that airline is very securely run. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And because the truck has considerable undercarriage protection, that line is very well protected. So again, a Hummer H3 Alpha has a lot of undercarriage protection. So that differential is protected, which means that airline, it would really take horrible luck for something to get up there and snag that airline. One thing that made Complete Off-Road a little bit happier when I brought the truck to them is when they realized that I had already installed the compressor and the rocker switches. So they said one of the #1 complaints they get is, hey, I don't like where you put the switch. So it wasn't so much just the hassle of running the wiring harness and deciding all that, but also just the driver convenience of where it goes. So if you're unfamiliar with these, it's pretty straightforward, and it is effectively interlocked. So if the compressor is not on, so that's the compressor just building its small amount of pressure needed to activate. It's got a small little reserve tank there. And again, I use CO2 for airing up and airing down. And then that switch just allows the pressure through a solenoid. Notice it makes no sound. There's no clack clack or anything like that. An ARB air compressor engages silently. The trick then is, how do I know it's engaged? And of course the answer is, you don't want to do this on a firm surface anyway, or a high friction surface. But if you're in loose gravel or something, engage it, try and turn, and you'll definitely know whether or not your front axle is locked. I think in that last bit I said an ARB air compressor makes no sound. Well, of course the air compressor makes a lot of sound. It's the air locker mechanism makes no sound really when it's locking. So again, you can see this is an independent front suspension truck. So you can see the power steering there, and there's the CV joint and shaft that goes over to the axle. And you can see that kind of bright orange bushing. When I had this work done, I also had the bushings replaced. So again, the differential unit itself is secured via those bushings, similar to engine mounts in 3 places. So as a kid, we always called the pig of the differential, the main housing, that doesn't really move much. The axles articulate up and down to the wishbone here of the front suspension. If you're not familiar with Hummers, it's actually a torsion bar system. But in any event, that's also another reason why I paid someone else to do this. This is not like a rear axle where you just pop the cover off and go to it. I'll put some stills in here, but you pretty much have to disassemble most of the front suspension. I learned that once just trying to change the gasket when I changed the fluid in the front differential, to realize there's no way to access the differential without pretty much pulling it out of the truck. So like I said, even if I were slightly tempted to take on a project like this myself, like maybe in a rear locker, the nature of the independent front suspension makes this a pretty big job. You pretty much have to disassemble the entire front suspension, drop out the front differential housing, then take that over to the bench. And if you're familiar with gear swaps or anything like that, it's an iterative process of getting the contact pattern right. The pinion gear can go forward and backward. The ring gear then goes basically side to side, and you keep messing around with shims until you get it right. You can see in some of these stills the airline of an ARB Air Locker. So that copper tube essentially brings the air pressure to a little sealed area. There's a little pinhole in there that gives the air pressure an opportunity to push and engage the locker. If that install is not done correctly, then of course that's where it would leak, and you end up not having an air locker when you need one out on the trail. Just add a couple more thoughts here as I wrap this up. I did notice in some of the earlier taping that the bells for the monks, I'm over here at St. Bede Abbey and Academy, a side job. I teach AP Physics here, and of course there's an airplane or a helicopter flew over, and then the Abbey bells. Sometimes there's an overflight by the Lite helicopter from the nearby hospitals. But in any event, just a couple other thoughts. I'm very glad I paid a competent off-road shop. I lost a fair bit of money trying to deal with a very reputable dealership who was interested in doing the work. First, I just had a hard time scheduling them, and then I'm glad I didn't, because I had two problems with the truck. A low-speed clunk when I threw the wheel. They correctly diagnosed that. It took them like 10 days before they figured it out, and it was one of the sway bar link ends. It kind of wallowed out the hole. So it was very hard to figure that out. At low speed, you would notice it. If you threw the wheel hard, one side, or you're a clunk. So, well, that can't be good. Well, it turned out to be something trivial, but still, like I say, if you take a truck in remote areas, you don't want check engine lights, weird clunks. The other one was, and I'd never had this happen before, he did not want to change some of the worn factory bushings that mount the differential because he said the bolts were stuck. I thought, man, I've never had a mechanic say I can't, unstuck bolts. But he said it's because I have an aluminum housing. Well, that sent me down a whole rabbit hole, because the Alphas have cast iron housings. So I went on Facebook groups, various message boards, and everyone said that can't be. Someone must have swapped it out at some point, which could only have been another dealer, so I got a little paranoid about that. And then one guy said, no, I have a 2008 Alpha, I have aluminum. Well, it's easy enough to check. You just take a magnet. But I challenged him like 2-3 times. I said, there's no way. That's an Alpha. It's got cast iron. He said, no, it's aluminum. All right, so I didn't check it. And I paid, I think, $370 for replacement cast iron housing. Took it to complete off-road, and they said, well, just for the record, we didn't use the new housing. You have a cast iron housing. So, of course, when I got it home, I took the little telescoping magnet, popped it on there, and, of course, the factory one is cast iron, as it was supposed to be. So just another reason why you go with a reputable dealership. No one took advantage of me. They just didn't know what they were talking about. And it's very odd that a skilled mechanic would make that mistake and not just put a magnet on it instead of just telling me, oh, it's aluminum, so I can't fix your truck. So that was quite a comedy of errors there, which I'm still out by $375. But again, so Complete Off-Road did a very nice job for me. I have total confidence in their work, and the total bill wasn't just to install the air locker, which I had already bought. It was also to install the bushings, the aftermarket poly bushings, to last much longer than the factory bushings. When they did that, another tail chasing thing I did with that same first dealer, it has a slight vibration above 75 miles an hour. So I balanced the tires, rotated the tires, got rid of most of it, and the tires do seem to have a little bit of cupping. But when they replaced the bushings, as the first guy said he couldn't do because he couldn't get the bolts out, all of that vibration went away. So I'm glad I didn't run out and buy a new set of tires until these are worn, just because that had nothing to do with it. It was the wear of the bushings that mounted the differential, presumably altered an angle or something, that was creating this shimmy that you would feel above 75 miles an hour. So very happy that that all went away. So again, when you take a vehicle out in a remote location, you want confidence, and paying a good off-road shop to do difficult work can help you maintain that confidence. So I'll close this video with a picture of that telescoping magnet on the differential housing there. I intend to make another video, hopefully not too distant into the future, where I'll actually go out and put the truck into some articulated situations and show the effectiveness of that air locker. If you don't want to wait for my video, again, there's plenty of them out there, ARB, Lite Brite, Dirt Lifestyle. So hopefully you find this video informative in terms of why someone with a mostly stock vehicle would install an ARB air locker and some of the nuances of getting it installed.